Doug has worked very hard for us. We can be very proud of him, and I'm sure you will now give him a very warm welcome when I call on him to give his presentation.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming on a lovely afternoon, and I'm sorry we've had to shut out the sunshine, as it were. I'll say a little bit more about that, and thank you, Handel, for that very kind introduction. I hope that I won't disappoint you. If you can't hear, do say, and if you can't see the screen well enough, do say. We've had a little difficulty. My computer and the new projector that's in situ here don't see eye to eye, or lens to lens, probably. So the image is slightly smaller than usual and perhaps not quite as distinct. If you fall asleep, don't worry about that, because that'll be my fault. Right? I hope that you'll take up Handel's invitation to stay for coffee afterwards, so that we can have a chat possibly about some of the things that arise from this talk. The title of the talk is, as you can see, Searching for the Spirit of Britain in the 1950s. I thought that title up about almost exactly a year ago now, when we were preparing the talks program for 2014. I thought it was a very good idea at the time, because I didn't want this talk to be simply a trip down memory lane, or the equivalent of sitting on the sofa flicking through the family album, as it were. I wanted to try to give it a little more depth than that. But when I eventually got down to preparing this talk, I realized how reckless I'd been. Because what on earth did I mean by spirit? I was sure when I thought about it, or at least perhaps I didn't think about it sufficiently to begin with. But when I came to actually prepare the talk, I realized my mistake. And not only did I realize my mistake, but I was immediately reminded of one of the many ways in which I misspent my youth. And that was queuing up outside the Gaiety Cinema in Kentford Hill to go in to see some pretty awful films. But one of those films, or pretty much always on the program, there was a Laurel and Hardy film. And as you probably remember, Laurel and Hardy too thought up what they believed to be good ideas, and they turned out to be otherwise, and they got themselves into a pretty awful mess. And not only did they get themselves into an awful mess, but they took to blaming each other. Now, I didn't have anybody to blame except myself, and here we are, right?
Dorothy,
There's the two stars, and there's me. And the only comparison is the mess that we've got ourselves into. Right? But there's no way back from here, right? We must go forward. And what I really want to do then is, with you, to try, first of all, to get some idea of what we mean by spirit. And then there are a few other things that we'll have to clarify as well. But spirit first, perhaps. Now, people have been down this road before, I discovered, right? And there's the famous, the renowned essayist, William Hazlitt. And he wrote a book, which was published in 1825, called The Spirit of the Age. And that's of his age, of course, right? And what he did, he relied on the sort of narrative of the lives of famous people of the time. And he tried to, as it were, take out from that, from their lives, their contribution, what the spirit was. He said of Wordsworth, for example, Mr. Wordsworth's genius is a pure emanation of the spirit of the age. Right? And the general opinion of that book was that it was a masterpiece, but it was flawed. Well, I couldn't see that that was a great deal of help looking for the spirit of the 1950s. So then I thought, well, maybe the word I use is the wrong word, and maybe I should have used portrait, because artists, of course, many artists are great portraitists. Here is Lucian Freud, and you can look at that, and you can see in those paintings, in those images of paintings, you can see a lot of the character of the individuals who are depicted. And he makes the point that the simplest gestures of a person tell stories, and the expressions tell stories, of course, and they do tell stories. But then I thought about an even greater portraitist, and that is Rembrandt. And I think Rembrandt is very well known for his self-portraits. And you're some distance away from this, and this is a reproduction, of course. But you can see, I think, I hope, in that portrait, in those features, a lot of character, a lot of what the artist has been through in his life. And his life was not a very happy life, one way and the other. So we are saying then, perhaps so far, that character, mood, and attitude have something to do with spirit. These things are inherited and acquired. They're shaped by custom and tradition and experiences and events. People have aspiration, achievement, disappointment, and failure. They have joy and tragedy in their lives. Whoops, what's that there? No. Whoops. What do I do about that now? That's good. They have joy and tragedy in their lives. So far then, we might say that spirit is the essence that is distilled from character and experience, maybe. And if you could look closely at the portrait, look at the eyes, and you can see so much of that essence in the eyes, I think. And then I found out that Elgar, in 1917, had published his composition was performed, 3 settings of poems by Lawrence Binyon. And of course, Lawrence Binyon, we are very familiar with, particularly at this time of the year, because of his poem For the Fallen. And if you look at that, there are lines in those 3 poems that perhaps give a new dimension to spirit. He talks of a mother for her children, flesh of her flesh they were, spirit of her spirit, the seed that in the spring's returning, and hearts that has one high heart, and so on. Another dimension, I think, added to this business of character. And don't forget, we're talking about a nation, not so much about individuals. So then, we'll come to some kind of understanding of what we mean by spirit. essence distilled from character and experience, and from the concept of motherland or fatherland, of the concept of the citizens being as sons and daughters, talking of filial duty, maternal love and maternal duty, but also of filial duty, the duty of the children to the mother. And we're talking of something that is a permeating, invisible essence. And I have taken this line, a force that splits the rock, something that cannot be denied, cannot be resisted, some driving force. So that's spirit, I think. So let's go on now. And we're talking of Britain. So what, who, when, and why are we looking at Britain in the 1950s? What was Britain then? Well, not much different from what it is now. England, Northern Ireland, but only 6 counties of Ireland. Scotland and Wales, and you can see there the status of the Channel Islands, the status of the Isle of Man, the status of the rest of Ireland too. Not necessarily one country on the face of it, and we'll see a bit more of that. Certainly an empire, but not an empire as it used to be at its peak. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, by this time, and for a long time, had dominion status, which made them entirely autonomous. India had been granted independence in 1947, and Sri Lanka and Burma a year after, and Britain had ceded the mandate that it had for Palestine to the United Nations in 1948. And who was Britain? Well, the 1951 census gave that population distribution, and you can see obviously that England is by far the most populous part of the country. And what about identity, distinctiveness, and unity? Well, one of the things that gives distinctiveness, of course, is language. And in 1951, there were 700,000 people in Wales who were fluent Welsh speakers. Plaid Cymru had been formed in 1925, and of course one of its one of its basic ideas was independence for Wales. And you may remember, or you may know of, this arson attack that was made in 1935 by those 3 men, one of whom was a distinguished playwright and academic, Saunders Lewis, on the RAF base at Penaberth on the Fleet Peninsula. The SNP was formed in 1934, and again, as we've seen very recently, arguing for independence. And in 1950, 3 students, it said at the behest of their professor, stole the coronation stone, or the stone of Scone, from under the coronation chair and took it to Abbey in Arbroath, because they claimed that it was originally a Scottish stone and a great icon. And of course, the troubles in Northern Ireland were festering, if not really exploding at that time. So, yes, one country, but not entirely unified, perhaps. And why 1950s? Well, history has its turning points. And a turning point for Britain, but it was not the 1st of January 1950. One of the turning points for Britain would have been the summer of 1945, for obvious reasons, the end of hostilities against Germany and against Japan and so on. So turning points then for the country as a whole, not 1950, but 1945. And turning points for ourselves. Many of us were growing up at that time, growing to adulthood, some of us. And some of us were already young adults, taking responsibilities at work, at home, and family. Turning points for ourselves then, too, in our own development. So yes, we're talking about the 1950s, but really the 1950s, as I hope we'll see, began in 1945. So let's look at this period, this prelude. Well, it was a period, obviously, initially, of great joy and great pride with the end of the wars and victory in the wars. And you can see there all sorts of celebrations that went on and congratulations that were offered and so on. And you can see it again, tremendous crowds and tremendous rejoicing at all levels, really. And there, I don't know whether that's come out very well, but that's a great parade, military parade in London in the celebration to mark that victory. And here's an interesting thing. We won the war. Now we have to win the peace, said Alderman Roberts. And Alderman Roberts, of course, was the father of Margaret Thatcher. But funnily enough, that is exactly what the Labour Party was saying too. And I would imagine that's about the only time that Margaret Thatcher's father and the Labour Party saw eye to eye. We certainly have to win the peace. Well, and of course, there was homecoming too. Many soldiers, many military personnel had been away from home for 4 or 5 years even. Children had grown up without knowing their father. They were welcomed home, but coming home must have been quite difficult for the family and for the person coming home. But nevertheless, they were welcomed, and somebody wrote a book fairly recently called Stranger in the House, and the stranger being, of course, the father. And the king wrote to every service person and said, "A grateful mother country is proud of your services." And we see this phrase again, mother country. Well, T.S. Eliot, if we can imagine that this is a new beginning, if you like, a spring after a long, long, hard winter of war. If you can imagine that this is the spring. T.S. Eliot in The Waste Land wrote, "April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire." Memory and desire. Well, memory. Memory of the First World War. There were many survivors of the First World War who suffered mentally, who suffered physically. There were many widows of the First World War, many families of the First World War who suffered all their lives, one way or the other, right into this period and beyond. It's difficult to convey, I think, the trauma, the horror of war. It's difficult to convey it. It's probably one of these things that we have to experience before we can get any kind of feeling about it. Artists and photographers help us to do that. You can see here, you can get some idea of the horror, but you cannot feel the horror. And the landings there, on the bottom left there, That, I think, is the aftermath of the Dieppe raid, which was a very ill-conceived and a botched raid that resulted in many, many people being killed, mainly Canadians, I understand. And the Japanese there putting people into prison. And there's a poem which I won't read, but it's a poem by a poet called Keith Douglas, who was killed in North Africa in the Second World War at the age of 24. And what he's saying there is that he came back, he retraced his steps to where there had been fighting, and he came back several weeks afterwards, and he saw the body of a dead German, and the body, of course, was decaying. It was infested with flies and so on. And he was making the point that the body was decaying, but his equipment, the equipment of this soldier, was intact. And he makes a reference to the person, the girl that he left, that this soldier had left behind. That poem gives you some idea. And of course, the Blitz too, right? The Blitz was traumatic for many people. In London, certainly, but elsewhere as well. And here are, of course, military cemeteries. And there are two sculptures there, done by a German sculpture, a woman sculpture. And I cannot remember her name, I'm sorry, but they are intended to express deep grief. And if you look at the if you look at the number of people who were killed, 705,000 British service personnel, 17,000 civilians, 2.3 million wounded in the First World War. You can see the casualties in the Second World War. And you can see at the bottom there that nearly 230,000 Britons died in the flu pandemic of 1919. So there is an enormous sense of loss, I think. And to add to loss and suffering and trauma, and add to that the Depression years, unemployment in some areas nearly 70% at one time, poverty, hunger, disease, homelessness, trauma, and bitterness too, lingering bitterness about some of the deprivations of the Depression years. And there are examples of people queuing and being fed and so on. So memory then, memory, very traumatic, very unpleasant, a huge sense of loss, very difficult, I think, to convey it in words, or indeed in any medium. But certainly, let's note that it was felt. What about desire? Well, the Beveridge Report was commissioned in 1942 and published soon after. And Beveridge, who was a former senior civil servant, talked of slaying the 5 giants, right? Want, disease, squalor, idleness, and ignorance. And that's Archbishop Temple, the Archbishop of Canterbury there. And he too supported that, and he said he wanted to make Britain a better place in which to be born, to grow up, to love, to live, to work, and to die. So desire then, desire at that, as it were, top level to ensure that things would be better in the future. Michael Young at the top there, who was one of the founders of the U3A movement in this country and did many other things too, he talked about using the resources of the people to make a better world. And R.H. Tawney, an important social reformer and commentator, a fairer, pleasanter, happier, and more beautiful Britain, and to create a safety net for society as a whole. Laudable desire then. But people, ordinary people, they obviously would go along with what we've already seen in terms of desire, but they would translate it in more simple terms. A comfortable home, a secure job, a reasonable wage, family and friends, and as Richard Hoggart said, a few frills. So great ambition then, nationally, modest ambition, if you like, on a personal level. Well, the election of 1945 was a great shock to many, particularly to Churchill, right? Labour had a majority of 146 on a 74% turnout. Quite surprising, bearing in mind that Churchill, of course, was very much a great war leader. And here are the giants that Attlee gathered into his cabinet to fight the giants that Beveridge had identified. And quickly, they passed a lot of legislation to create that kind of safety net, that better world as they saw it. Disease, the NHS, the National Health Service Act, you can see how they've legislated to combat that. Squalor, New Towns Act and other things. Ignorance, the Education Act that had already been passed by Churchill's government. And idleness, nationalization of so much. Well, nationalization, these were the things that were nationalized in this period. Bank of England, civil aviation, road haulage, railways, power, coal, iron and steel. Industries employing 2 million people. The welfare state, well, you can see all the measures that were brought in to operation legislatively and in terms of policy, national insurance, increased old age pensions, child allowances, and so on. Tripartite secondary schooling, free milk in schools, grants for higher learning or higher education study, youth services, adult education, and grants to community organizations. A tremendous program then. And of course, the National Health Service stands out at that time. The most civilized step any country has ever taken, it is said. And there's the man who did it. But of course, there was also what was called the return to normality, to what there was before, as well as this new approach. The Eton and Harrow cricket match, for example, the debutantes' ball, the Oxford and Cambridge boat race. The public schools remained. The Attlee government did not touch the public schools, and Attlee himself was a tremendous supporter of his old public school. But of course, the FA Cup was reinstated, I think in 1946. So there was a return to what there was before as well as the new. And of course, in 1947, there was the royal wedding. In 1948, Britain staged the Olympic Games. Quite a defiant thing to do in a way, an extraordinary thing to do at that time, bearing in mind the problems that the country had faced or was facing. Well, there was peace too, right? But again, in the words of a poet, peace but not the kiss of peace. And what the poet meant by that was, yes, there was a cessation of hostilities, but we weren't living entirely at peace in the world. And there is a famous saying in classical history, if you want peace, prepare for war. Ernest Bevin, who was the foreign secretary, said, I want an atomic bomb with a Union Jack on it. National service was instituted in 1947, and the Malaya emergency began in 1948, and the first atomic bomb test occurred, British atomic bomb test occurred in 1951. But of course, there would have been a lot of preparation for that in the period we're talking about. Also, the United Nations was formed, and NATO was formed at that period. So we're going into the 1950s with this legacy of the post-war 1940s then. Peace, yes, there was gratitude, relief, pride, and self-confidence as a result of the peace that had been won, of the victory that had been won. There was memory too, loss, suffering, indelible scars, trauma. There was desire, modest personal demands, but the retention of iconic things like public schools, public school activity, and so on, but this great desire for fairness and the well-being and security of all. And a desire too, on the part of Britain, on the part of the government, to remain a star player on the international field, as it were. But there was a price to be paid for all of that. And the question is, was Britain able to pay that price and willing to pay that price? So this is what we take in then to the 1950s. And that image at the bottom there, I intend that to, in a way, in its modesty, if you like, that mother with her young child walking down that drab street has modest demands, whereas Parliament, the government, has much more grandiose plans, albeit plans that include the welfare of that mother and her child. And what comes through then, perhaps in terms of essence? There's a reverence for the past, there's a reverence for the status quo, there's compassion for those who are disadvantaged, and there's a determination to make things better. So we go into the 1950s in that way. And we'll take the first half of the 1950s. And the first thing, of course, was the Festival of Britain, 1951. And it was intended unashamedly to show the best of Britain. And it was acclaimed. It was said to be successful. It did that successfully. And it is said that 8.5 million people visited that exhibition on the South Bank. But it was a period of austerity too. Britain was impoverished by World War II. Lend-Lease had ended. That was, I won't go into that, but that was a system whereby America provided armaments and other things. They withdrew that, but it was replaced by Marshall Aid. Marshall Aid, again, was provided to countries in Europe by America, partly altruistically and partly to prevent the spread of communism, or what they felt would be the spread of communism, taking over impoverished, rebellious countries, if you like. So they wanted to make sure that these countries were prosperous and were calm, as it were. The argument was that the British industry was outdated. They were less able to compete in the export markets because of that. There was a harsh winter in 1947, and there really was, apparently, a genuine threat of starvation as a result of that. The pound was devalued in 1949. The mood of the country, well, there was disenchantment, a mood of anticlimax, a malaise, a feeling of alienation to some extent, a feeling of being let down to some extent too. 42% considered emigrating at that time. And Tennessee Williams, the famous American playwright, visiting Britain, said England is the most unpleasant, uncomfortable, and expensive place to live. So not really, certainly an austere place at that time. And the queues, of course, you see the queues there. You see the bomb damage there, which remained for a long time. And there's rationing, of course, rationing of those items. Even bread was rationed for 2 years, from 46 to 48. And rationing was not entirely eliminated until 1954. And when it was, of course, you can see how the crowds flocked into the shops. There was also an acute housing shortage in the 50s. You can see the bomb damage, right, or aspects of the bomb damage, not only in London, but in other major towns and cities, and I've just given a couple there. Major bomb damage then. But also, of course, there was a housing shortage in another way, because the houses that weren't bomb damaged, many were pretty awful, right? You can see some of the examples there, and some of the examples that we would know, right? In the South Wales valleys, for example. And Idris Davis, a poet born and bred in Rumney, Idris Davis wrote these lines about the brutes who built so basely in the dark Victorian night. And there's something in that. If you look at all those kinds of dwellings, they're pretty awful, and really they had to be replaced along with the new housing to replace those houses that were destroyed. And we are familiar with some of these scenes too, perhaps. And there was the New Towns Act of 1946 that saw things differently, of course. And there is Stevenage New Town, which was the first, or one of the first, to be built or commissioned. I don't think they came as a finished package. I mean, they were built over a period of time. And what we're seeing of Stevenage there probably has developed over a number of years. Cwmbran similarly. And if you look at the map, you will see the designated areas of new towns in England. I think in Scotland too, I'm not sure, but certainly there's no reference there to Cwmbran. And Cwmbran was designated a new town in 1949, I think. So new towns, certainly. And Stevenage looks quite pleasant there. But look at these. Right? This was another response to the housing shortage, building up instead of outwards. And the government gave bigger grants to local authorities if they built high-rise living accommodation. And there again, you can see the kind of thing that was built. But if you look at the top left there, you can see too that new estates were being built, and we know that, don't we? We may well ourselves have lived on those new estates. I talked to somebody very recently about this, and they said, yeah, they were pretty unpleasant in many ways, this kind of building policy. But at least there were amenities which were not, there were sort of household amenities like indoor water supply, flushing toilets and that kind of thing, which weren't in many of the older houses. And then, of course, the famous prefabs. I think it was Bevan who called them rabbit hutches, but many people were happy in those rabbit hutches, again, because they were better than what they came from. New council housing on the top right there, and you can see the kind of thing that was happening in the distance at the bottom. One of the casualties, of course, of that new housing policy was the destruction of old communities. And you can see something of community there, right? Talking over the fence, playing in the street, going on trips locally, and so on. That didn't happen in the new areas so much. Well, there was an election in February 1950, and the Labour majority fell from 146 to 5 on an 84% turnout. So there is an expression, if you like, despite all the altruism, all the humanity, if you like, that was displayed by the Labour government, there was an underlying disenchantment, an underlying unhappiness. And it was shown in the result of that election. There was a further election in October 1951, and the Conservatives got into power by an overall majority of 16, again on an 82% turnout. Think of the size of that turnout. That's quite important, I think. Well, this was Churchill's team, as it were, or some of them anyway. Right? Some of them are well known, the others perhaps, two perhaps not so much, Thornycroft and I think Maxwell Fyfe. I think that's Maxwell Fyfe. Maxwell Fyfe at one point was the Home Secretary, but he was also Secretary of State, or he had responsibility for Wales. And of course Maxwell Fyfe came from a family of fruit importers. And he was known to many people as Die Bananas, I think. But anyway, so the policies and aspirations of this government, look at them. They wanted to encourage initiative and enterprise. They wanted to create a property-owning democracy, and we heard about that much later too. They wanted social peace, material plenty, yes. Scientific advance and full employment. Churchill himself, argued for a 4-day working week. Right? They wanted to improve their relations abroad as well. And there's not much difference between that and the Attlee government. And look, the NHS and welfare provision untouched. Only iron, steel, and road haulage were denationalised. Full employment maintained, but economic problems and rationing did continue, of course. But Macmillan, who was Minister of Housing at that time, achieved the Tory party's target of building 300,000 new homes every year. And that was quite some achievement. But not much difference there between the two governments. But then, of course, there were foreign problems. The Malayan emergency that began in 1948 and really lasted right through until 1957. Malaya was a rich source of rubber and minerals. You know that the Malayan Liberation Army, a communist organization, was attacking plantations, mines, and the workers. Policies varied from relocating workers, villagers, into fortified villages. There was an attempt, I think it was General Templar, there was an attempt to win over the hearts and minds of the local population. But there were some things too. There was certainly brutality on the part of the insurgents, but there's accusations too that there was brutality on the part of Britain, and certainly there was imprisonment without trial. But it was a long and very unpleasant campaign. And then the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, and you can see Korea there on the right-hand side of the map, that finger of blue land coming down there, can you see it? Important, not far from southern Russia, very close to China. Again, a gateway perhaps, or certainly a footprint, a communist footprint, and very much feared. And North Korea had invaded South Korea in 1950. Well, Britain went into that war with America and other allies. The casualties are quite surprising, really. You can see the number killed and the number wounded and the number missing and the number captured. An expensive war. And so many of those people who fought in that war in Malaya were national service people. And Attlee was Prime Minister when that war began, and he said, yes, it's distant. Korea is a long way away, but it's nonetheless an obligation. You can see the people, the soldiers, are waiting to embark, if you like. And like all soldiers waiting to embark, they're full of smiles and expectation. And you can see some of the results of the fighting. On the bottom left there, those are dead bodies, frozen dead bodies. I think they happen to be Chinese dead bodies, but I think you could say there would be a lot of Allied dead bodies too. And here is the memorial. The names of men from Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa who fell in the Korean War and have no known grave. They died with men of other countries fighting to uphold the ideals of the United Nations. So, an expensive war and an obligation, nevertheless. Well, the Mau Mau emergency, 1952 to 60, again, expensive, certainly in terms of the Kenyans, but also in terms of British involvement too. And the problem there was that the Kikuyu, the indigenous population, wanted land for themselves, and they began to attack settlers and so on. And here are some more pictures about that kind of emergency. And then there's the Cyprus emergency too. Cyprus, an important military base, of course. You know the issue there. AOKA was the terrorist organization, or the Greek, let's say the Greek terrorist organization. They wanted to remove Britain and unify Cyprus with Greece. The Turkish Cypriots also wanted to get the British out, but they didn't want, they wanted to get rid of AOKA too. In the end, there was a negotiated settlement, which Macmillan negotiated, but again, expensive, surprisingly expensive in terms of British military and civilian deaths. And there's Makarios and there's Grivas, who is the AOKA leader. And here are some examples. You can see on the bottom left, murder in the street, probably Nicosia, right? You can see two bodies there, or at least certainly severely injured, if not dead. And you can see the kind of thing that was done. In all of that, I put up there Ministry of Defense, because these are Ministry of Defense figures. They surprise me, and I think they probably surprise you. But the total number of service personnel who died in Malaya, in Korea, in Kenya, in Cyprus, and in Suez over that 1950s seems to me to be surprisingly high. But those are the figures that the Ministry of Defense quote. So certainly then, peace, but not the kiss of peace, as we said earlier. And then there's the Cold War, of course. The Cold War, this tension between the West and the Soviet Union. And it's exercised in different ways, isn't it? The build-up of nuclear weapons, nuclear missiles all the time, certainly nuclear bombs, the blockade of Berlin, for example, and so on. And it was brought about, I suppose, by expansionism on the part of the communists, infiltration, blockade, as we've seen, nuclear bombs and armaments, and hostile stances taken by the West and by the Soviet Union, and also, of course, espionage. Well, there are some famous spies, right? Blake, Fuchs, Burgess, McLean, Philby, Cairncross, and Blunt. There were others, but these are ones that are familiar to us. Blake, I don't think, was actually caught until about 1961, but the others, and Blunt, of course, were not unmasked until much later, but some, and Philby too, but they were all active at this time, and Burgess and McLean fled to Russia in 1952. So, certainly espionage. And what is the response then of the West, including Britain? Well, the Berlin airlift, the British Army of the Rhine, of course, the cleansing of the Secret Service is, I wonder about that, right? British nuclear weapons, certainly, accommodating American bases in this country, and you could see them there on that map. You probably just have difficulty making them out, but they're all pretty well down the East Coast, where there would be located American missiles, American bombers, and so on. And somebody said that all of that made Britain into America's unsinkable aircraft carrier. So certainly then. And here are some of the attitudes expressed. We've seen that Bevin said, I want an atomic bomb with a Union Jack on it. I want our own, he was foreign secretary at the time, I want our own atomic bomb. Leonard Cheshire, who was involved in the dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan, addressed students at Oxford in the 1946, 1947, I think, and said, if the bomb is used in Europe, there is no point in anything you are doing, right? You being these young students. There's no point in it all. You might as well pack it all in, right? And Churchill himself said, the bomb worries me more than all my other troubles put together. And Khrushchev said, we get your dust, you get our dust. The winds blow and nobody is safe. And only slightly more eloquently, perhaps, and perhaps not in the same context, T.S. Eliot said, I have seen fear in a handful of dust. And all that seems to sum up the fear of the Cold War and its consequences. And it's expressed too in sculpture, called somebody's called it the geometry of fear. And the argument is that those sculptures made by some famous sculptors, right, in their grotesqueness, in their ugliness, in their fearfulness, express the horror of nuclear war and the deep feelings about the possibility of nuclear war. And you could see that to some extent too. Right? The figures are gnarled and scarred. Well, but life went on, or I'm sorry to use that phrase, but the country went forward. Unfortunately, in 1952, King George VI died, Attlee was very close, apparently, to George VI, and got on with him very well and liked him greatly. And I think he was liked probably by the vast majority of the people in the country and was much mourned. And there you can see the lying in state, you can see the gun carriage used at his funeral and so on, and the mourners. But of course, that was followed the following year by the coronation. And here was a time of rejoicing, a time of new hope. A young queen and a young consort, typifying, if you like, the aspirations of the country. And of course, this whole idea of pageant and parade and so on went on throughout the decade and well beyond. Some of those images may not be contemporary, but what they depict, the parades, the ceremonies, went on at that time. That fly past of Shackleton bombers, for example, is of the period. But you can see the country's love of parade and pageant. And it was a time of achievement too. Right? The 4-minute mile, the climbing of Everest. The climbing of Everest, the announcement at least, timed to coincide with the coronation. So you can see that. And here, in a different sphere, or different spheres, you can see a battery of British Nobel Prize winners. Physics, literature, physics again, chemistry, medicine, and so on. And of course, Churchill for literature. So, great, and Noah Baker, the Peace Prize in 1959. And in 1953, the discoverers of the destruction, of the structure of DNA. And that bit on the left there is part of a memorial or commemorative window at the college in Cambridge, where some of that work was done. So, great achievement then. I've put that up because the car industry, I mean, it had its problems during the time, but it was a very active, innovative industry. And you can see how much a design and development was carried on. And at the bottom there is an image of the steelworks. And of course, the steel works depended very much on the car industry and vice versa. So certainly something there to note. But a period of disaster too. And here is one of the most poignant disasters, really. We don't have them so much around here, but we down in the south of England, where Royal Marines have traditionally been based, there are Royal Marine Cadet services. And in December 1951, a troop of cadets was marching in the dark on a main road, in the winter, obviously, and a bus ran into them, and 24 were killed. A terrible tragedy, and something quite unexpected. And here are other tragedies too. The smog of 1952, for example. It's said that 12,000 people in London died as a result of that over a 60-day period. And there were other disasters. The Landau air crash, the people coming back from an international in Ireland, and the plane crashing on coming into land, 80 people killed. The Farnborough air disaster, the Farnborough show, where a plane exploded, I think, and again showered the spectators with debris. 3 comet crashes at that time. So you could see that there were certainly disasters. And then there were the gales of 1952 and 1953. I think gales is an understatement. Gales and floods, certainly. The Lynmouth floods in North Devon, 34 people killed in those in 52. And look at the number of people who were killed as a result of the East Coast floods in 1953. And also the sinking of that ferry from Larne to Stranraer, in which 133 people were also killed. Many more, I believe, were killed on what would be the west coast of Europe, in the Netherlands and so on. So certainly disasters. Train crashes too. And you can see two of the most horrendous there. I just want to make a point about that, and we'll make it later, perhaps, that those were disasters, but somehow or other we distance ourselves from disasters. But it's something to think about. But let's go on to home and family. We talked before about normality, and there is an example in the top left of a kind of idyllic family, husband and wife and two children. Almost an iconic family, isn't it? Royal family, of course. But here are images of family, and what is intended to come through about the family at this time, that it was normal for a family to be like this. This was normality. The family was the cornerstone of society. It gave security to all. It gave security to the family members, but it gave security to society too. It was a place of respite. It was a place where people felt a sense of responsibility, parents for their children, and eventually children for their parents. A sense of responsibility and obligation then. And the role of women at this time, women played an important part, obviously, in family. And they were advised constantly by women's magazines and others, the traditional position, mother and homemaker, traditional position in the dance of life. Their role was to send out husbands and children happy in the morning. The motto of the Mothers' Union, certainly at that time, husbands, children, and God. A woman's place is in the home, said Alfred Munnings. Right? A companion for, but not an equal to, a husband. Those were the days. And I've asked a question at the bottom, right? Did women exist at that time for men? Right? Right? It's an interesting point. And look at that there. Look at that in the middle. Stress is dessert spelled backwards. Right? So, you know, everybody in their place. Right? But you see, 25% of women were in paid employment. Right? 25% of women were in paid employment. But there's almost a stereotypical employment in a way, in food factories, certainly in nursing, teaching, bus conductors, not bus drivers, I don't think, but bus conductors, typists, right? Doing, as it were, copying out other people's work, not taking initiatives themselves. And telephonists, again, making it possible for other people to converse and perhaps make decisions and so on. And I've asked the question about equal pay. It appears in the 1950s that people working in the public services, women working in the public services, had equal pay for equal work, but not in private industry. So the role of women is an issue. And what about leisure? Well, we'll have to move on a bit, I think. What about leisure? Well, various attractions in terms of leisure. Television, by 1955, there were 4 million television sets. there were over 73,000 pubs, nearly 20,000 clubs, football, top-class football attracted crowds of regularly of 70,000, speedway and greyhound racing, 200 million dance hall entries. Right? Think of that. Think of the pavilion. Right? Don't think of the pavilion. 10 million football poolers. Right? 10 million people doing the football pools every week. And 500,000 pigeon fanciers. You could walk down the street and every back garden, walk down the alleyways, back alleys, and almost every garden had a pigeon loft at one time. So certainly those were things. And of course radio was still very popular. And these are just some of the radio programs of that period, I guess, with the Goon Show in the middle, of course. But we'll move swiftly on from there, perhaps. Holidays. People had aspirations to go on holiday. Sometimes you could only afford to go on a day trip, but people had other aspirations too. Look at Blackpool at the bottom left there, for example, teeming with people. And these advertisements, Butlins particularly too, people going off on trips. Campbell's sailing, I think, the Campbell ship, I think, certainly for a day trip, and so on. Social class. Well, we saw earlier that people wanted to sort of keep the old system too. And social class. Well, it has been said that Britain was one people, one race, a common history divided by class. Right? It's been said that as soon as someone spoke, they were sort of pigeonholed into a class, right? It was the time, of course, when there was received pronunciation and all that kind of thing. There's a criticism that the country was run by ex-public school boys and Oxbridge graduates. Well, we hear that now too, don't we, right? Whether it's true or not, I don't know, but we hear it. And here's some kind of rough distribution, if you like. 70% of the population was said to be manual working class, 26 middle class, there were 31 dukes, 204 earls, 38 marquises in 1959, and at that time, there was still 250,000 domestic servants and 600 butlers. Well, I don't remember having a butler. But anyway, but you can see here some of the contrasts, right? You can see some of the contrasts here. Factory workers, perhaps civil servants, people sitting in front of their houses, talking, socializing, and you can see opposite that another way of socializing. You can see the grand house at the top, or the grand interior, and the more modest interior, and so on. And you can see at the bottom Eton College, and you can see what appears to be a state school in need of repair. So it's certainly a country of class in social terms at that time. Crime, well, there was an increase in crime, significant increase in crime over the period. There was a fear of youth crime and youth culture and teddy boys. Right? Teddy boys were accused of all sorts of things, and many of them just dressed up in Edwardian costume. There was a fear of violence, and there was theft and destruction, called vandalism, not most of it. Vandalism seemed to be a feature, but there was a reduction in armed robbery. And there was punishment too. Judicial corporal punishment, abolished in 1948. But corporal punishment wasn't abolished in schools until 1983, and that's interesting. Right? There were moves to abolish hanging, capital punishment, blocked by the Lords, and not really enforced, not really came into force until 1969. And there are some of the famous cases, or the notorious cases. Timothy Evans, executed in 1950. Bentley, remember Bentley? 1953. Christie, 1953. Thomas Harris, convicted of murder and hung at Swansea Prison in 1954. Ruth Ellis, you will remember. And Vivian Teed was much less famous, but he too was the last person to be hanged at Swansea jail. So certainly that. And I have to refer to homosexuality because it was a feature of the time in the context of punishment. There was a concerted effort on the part of the Home Secretary, the Metropolitan Police, and the Director of Public Prosecutions to punish and eradicate what they called this dangerous vice and a threat to society. And you can see the number of prosecutions that there were in 1952. There were high-profile arrests, Montague, Pitt Rivers, and Wild Blood, those first three there. Alan Turing, a hugely gifted scientist, right? And two famous actors there. All of them were arrested, some imprisoned, some got away without being affected. But Turing, of course, committed suicide. Right? The Wolfenden Committee was set up in 1954. It was set up really to look at prostitution, but they added, as an afterthought, homosexuality to it. Chadvara set up the Samaritans in 1953, and it is said partly to provide some assistance to people who had been affected by this kind of clampdown, if you like. And of course, it wasn't decriminalized until 1967. Right? And come now then to outsiders. Right? Outsiders. Well, if you look at the operas of Peter Grimes, the operas of Benjamin Britten, you'll see that they contain a lot of outsiders. Arguably, homosexuals would be outsiders in society. And you can see here, not that these people are portrayed as homosexuals, but they are portrayed as outsiders, right? And you can see, driven out, Peter Grimes, driven out to his death by a false accusation of murdering a young boy, right? Albert Herring, a comic opera, where an outsider is trying to get into society. Billy Budd, who is good, an outsider because he's good amongst a crew of liars and corrupt people. Owen Wingrave, much later, a pacifist who dies to prove his courage. And a book written by Colin Wilson, called The Outsider, and it was said to be a seminal work on alienation and moments of resolve and optimism. So this feature of an outsider then, of a person being against society or on the outside of society. So what can we say then about this period? Certainly issues to do with nationhood, right? Spectacle, pageant and parade, achievement, looking the world in the eye, united though in fear and defense, and you might say defiance too. There's an acceptance of disruption of communities, austerity, social stratification, the rule of the elite. There's a resistance to the rejection of the demands of upstarts, the Mau Mau, the AOCA, the MLA, and so on. There is regret too. We are sorry for the disasters, but to what extent can we identify, empathize with the victims of those disasters? We tend to get on with our lives. And Bruegel depicted that in one of his famous paintings. Auden picked it up in one of his poems, that we turn our back on other people's disasters. There were aspirations, job, home, family, leisure, living and partly living, some people would say, but modest aspirations. And there is the beginning of difference to emerge, of outsiders. Okay, the last bit, right? Eden. Churchill resigned in 1955 and Eden succeeded him. Eden, very much an insider, right? A World War hero, First World War hero, 3 times Foreign Secretary, Leader of the House, and Knight of the Garter. Highly qualified, very much liked, well thought of by the public as a whole and by politicians. Except that Churchill said privately, I don't believe Anthony can do it. Right? But Anthony went to the people in May of that year, and he won the election by a majority of 60. Right? And then came the Suez crisis within a year, I suppose. Right? And you know the background to that. Nasser, you can see him and Eden there, and look, seeming to be on good terms. Right? Nasser seized the canal, nationalized the Suez Canal. And you can see, I hope you can see from that inadequate map there, how vital the Suez Canal is as a waterway. He nationalized the canal. It is said because Britain and the United States refused to finance the Aswan Dam. It was presidential year, right? So America, for that reason alone, didn't want a big hoo-ha in the Middle East. And they were afraid too of Soviet intervention. And there was this plot between Britain, France, and Israel. Britain and France wanted to go in there to secure the canal. So they hatched this plot that Israel would invade and they would go in to separate Israel and Egypt as peacekeepers. Well, that blew apart, of course, right? Israel did in fact invade and more or less overran Egypt in a matter of days. Britain bombed airfields and sent in 13,500 troops, right? France similarly, soon afterwards. But they had to withdraw immediately because America threatened not to support a much needed loan from the IMF and for other reasons. Great humiliation then for Britain. And Britain caught out in subterfuge. Britain caught out too with a prime minister and a foreign secretary, I believe, who lied in the House of Commons, right? Which was, of course, a real sin. Eden resigned genuinely on health grounds in 1957. And there are just some of the things. You can see the gung-ho stuff in the newspapers, and you can just about pick out Bevan's comment at the bottom. I don't know if you can. It said, Sir Anthony is a knave or a fool, right? And so it proved, I think. And you can see that the canal blocked as well, and so on. Well, and of course, it all masked the uprising in Hungary against the Soviet Union, who had a sort of free run to do what they liked in Hungary to counter that rebellion. Macmillan became Prime Minister on the resignation of Eden. Here he is. He too had quite a pedigree, right? A high office, a safe pair of hands, an officer and a gentleman, it was said. But of course, he was the principal architect. Although he was Chancellor of the Exchequer and not Foreign Secretary, he was the principal architect of the Suez debacle. Right? And Britain was humiliated and shamed. No longer a great power, but not even a good power, it was said. He inherited too a severe financial crisis. So he had to repair that, and he had to repair relations with the US and Egypt. He made a famous speech in 1960 in Africa, South Africa. He talked of winds of change blowing through Africa. He might have said, if he'd spoken earlier in Britain, but winds of change blowing through Britain too, right? There's a thing there by Colin Wilson at the top, which you probably can't read. Colin Wilson was the author of The Outsider, as we saw. The average man is a conformist, accepting miseries and disasters with the stoicism of a cow standing in the rain. Not true anymore, I think, right? There's a change coming about. All rationing finished in 1954. Never had it so good, said Macmillan in July 1957. Great consumer demand, an explosion of consumer demand. Unemployment low, wages, exports, investments all increasing. Inflation was a concern, but there was a great demand for goods of this kind. At the top it says, I shop, therefore I am. Right? That's a take on Descartes, isn't it? Right? And of course, the rise of angry young men and the kitchen sink. Right? The theatre of the day was dominated by people like Terence Rattigan. And Terence Rattigan famously said, I write my plays for Aunt Edna, a nice, respectable, middle-class, middle-aged lady sitting in the third row. Right? But people like Raymond Williams said, culture is ordinary. Kingsley Amis wrote, culture is real and important, not the property of an exclusive class entered from the right school. Look back in anger. A resentful, disillusioned, frustrated young voice, that's Osborne, right? An anti-hero is the main character. The entertainer, again, a savage demolition of Macmillan's delusional Britain. A Taste of Honey by Sheila Delaney, a play about class, about race, and about sexual orientation. Barriers are being broken here. And here are some of the writers, some of the playwrights, some of the novelists of the day. And here are some of these things were made into films, and there were other films in similar vein. The one at the bottom is interesting because I don't think it quite fits. It's about a sense of duty and giving your word, right? Quite interesting, but we won't delay on it now. And of course, kitchen sink, right? We're talking about the kitchen sink drama, right? Well, here's kitchen sink art, quite literally. John Bratby taking these ordinary subjects. You can't be much more ordinary than that. Right? And youth culture. Well, youth culture coming from America now, right? This cult of youth, if you like. Certainly a youth market, right? for records and all that kind of thing, but a youth culture too. Young people asserting their presence, and you can see all of this with those films. And here are some of the iconic people. And music, of course, this new music, skiffle, rock and roll. Rab Butler talked of the loosening of Victorian corsetry. Right? Presley turns revolt into a style. Rock around the clock riots in and around cinemas. What they would do, they'd have this film and they wanted to dance. There wasn't any room, so they'd tear up the seats and dance, right? Jeremy Thorpe's verdict, a fourth-rate film with fifth-rate music can pierce the thin shell of civilization and turn people into whirling dervishes. Well, and then, on this business of the cult of youth, we have to mention very briefly the Munich air disaster in February 1958. young players for Manchester United, Busby Babes as they were called. 8 of them were killed in that, along with a lot of other people. Emigration, over 700,000 people emigrated in the period 1946 to 50 from Britain. In 1945, it is estimated that 25,000 people of black and Asian origin lived in Britain. By 1961, that had increased to over 330,000. Some people say 500,000. They were concentrated in poor housing areas. Churchill had expressed fears about what he called a magpie society. Certainly, there was still anti-Semitism. There were notices put up in boarding houses and in pubs and so on. No dogs, no blacks, no Irish. Right? And there was the cry that we have heard, part of the cry we've heard anyway, stealing our jobs are now women. We've had stealing our jobs recently, haven't we? Right? Well, there were race riots, 2 notable examples in 1958 in Nottingham, where there were riots sparked off by white youngsters, resulting in serious injuries. In Notting Hill, a little later that year, 9 youths went what they called nigger hunting and blackberrying, and gravely injuring three black men. There was retaliation, of course. White mobs rampaging through the streets, black youths retaliating, and the riots lasted for 5 days. There were many injuries, 108 arrests, and severe punishments. So a new phenomenon then. Right? There were more sedate, more peaceful protests too. A protest against the authorization of Liverpool to flood the village of Capel to create a dam for extra water in 1956. And it says there, Cofiwch Draiwerin, remember Draiwerin. And at the bottom, there is the first CND march. The first one was from London to Aldermaston. The other ones were in the opposite direction against, and Aldermaston was an atomic research area. So what is the character of Britain then? And here I've tried to say patriotic, courageous, assertive, indelibly scarred and fearful, stoical, compliant, undemanding, respectful, respectable, restrained, compassionate, achieving, but then also, as we all are, contradictions, alienating, prejudiced, and cruel too, acquisitive. It showed itself at government level to be conniving and shameful, and it showed too that many people, particularly those who were articulate, were frustrated, questioning, and rejecting. It was a country that was old and weary, but resolute. The spirit of Britain, have we found it? Well, I don't know, right? The searching for a permeating essence distilled from character traits, an onward driving animated force. What have we found then? A bonding, a mother country and offspring united in instinctive mutual love and obligation, I argue, right? A resilience to cope with triumph, hardship and disaster, to continue as a star player on the world stage. But a burgeoning resolve on the part of many people now to be the actors, not the audience. Old and weary, yes, but a thirst for change, a thirst for experiment, for new ventures and new horizons. And here, that is Robin Knox Johnson, who at this moment is probably halfway across the Atlantic, sailing single-handedly, and he's 75. He's not sailing that ship, But that ship is a Greek ship, right? And this quotation is from the poem Ulysses by Tennyson. And what he says is, he rallies his crew together, he's come home, and he wants to go again. And he rallies his companions and he says, "'Tis not too late to seek a newer world, though much is taken, much abides. And though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, one equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield." I will argue that's what we took into the 60s. You may think otherwise. The question is, there's another question too. There are two questions. Is that a fair assessment? And the second question is, when we did sail into the 60s, did we set the right course? Thank you for listening. I've gone on too long, but thank you.